On the 15th of September 2006, an EasyJet Airbus A319 from Alicante, Spain, was bound for Bristol in the United Kingdom. However, roughly 85 minutes after takeoff over Nantes in France, all of the plane's electrical and communication systems suddenly failed, leaving the pilots having to control the aircraft manually. Little did they know that their aircraft was on a collision course with another aircraft. With no means of communication with the outside world, they would come within 19 seconds of certain disaster. This is the story of EasyJet Flight 6074. EasyJet Flight 6074 from Alicante, Spain to Bristol in the UK on September 15, 2006 was a routine trip regularly taken by holidaymakers who wanted a change in weather and scenery. It was the end of summer, so most of the passengers aboard the flight were British and heading back home from their vacation on a short 2.5-hour journey. On the Airbus A319 were a total of 138 passengers, as well as 6 crew members, including a 42-year-old captain who, while experienced with 9,000 total flight hours, barely had any experience on the A319 with less than 400 hours under his belt. This was the same for his first officer, who had about 500 hours flying the aircraft. The aircraft being used was an Airbus A319-100, which EasyJet had recently purchased to replace its aging Boeing 737s. It had its first flight in February of that year and had logged just under 2,000 total flight hours, including an important flight which happened just prior to Flight 6074. This flight had occurred earlier that day from the London Luton Airport on the way to Alicante. During the journey, there had been an issue where the pilots had received a fault message about the first electric generator control unit on the plane's ECAM. They were, however, able to safely complete the flight. After arriving in Alicante, the captain of the flight informed the crew of Flight 6074 about the problem with the generator, which was powered by the left engine. He informed the crew that it had to be turned off with the auxiliary power unit, or APU, activated to complete the flight. But since the trip back to the UK was short, it would be able to be completed under the provisions of the Minimum Equipment List, or MEL, which allowed it to continue with a single non-functional electric generator. The flight crew were therefore well aware of the issue with the left side electric generator control unit. At 9:26 a.m., the aircraft lined up on the runway, took off, and climbed to its cruising altitude of 32,000 feet. The flight crew were unaware, however, of just how severe the situation really was. After nearly 90 uneventful minutes, the pilots of Flight 6074 heard a loud sudden thud with the plane over the region of Nantes in France. This was followed by the captain's display systems turning offline and the autopilot disconnecting. The first officer still had his instruments working, and so flight control was handed over to him temporarily. Nevertheless, he had to manually pilot the aircraft, diverting all his attention while the captain searched for the source of the malfunction. The radio panel had also gone offline, and so they weren't able to reach out to air traffic control. Worryingly, Flight 6074 had been cut off from communication with the outside world. However, the ECAM was still online and had checklists which offered the flight crew some options they could use in order to restore the flight to its regular state. The checklists included a switch of the ACES feed to the alternate position, which could allow the plane to draw electricity from a different source. But for this to work, the fault light in the push button would have needed to be illuminated. However, just like most of the electronic systems in the cockpit, it had gone offline. This presented a dilemma for the captain, who was uncertain whether the system had shut down due to a fault or simply gone offline like other electrical systems. However, lacking any better alternatives, he opted to press the switch regardless. However, nothing occurred as the aircraft's electrical systems remained off. The design of the push button meant that there was no way to indicate if it had successfully been activated if its caption light didn't illuminate, which was the case on Flight 6074. Despite the radio systems seemingly off, the captain tried to contact air traffic control. However, it appeared that the electric fault had affected transmission as well. The first officer also tried using his own radio systems, but was met with the same outcome. It looked like they were now flying completely on their own. Meanwhile, despite some outside electrical failures, the passengers in the cabin had been unaware of the events. But it wasn't hard to notice for the controller at the Brest Area Control Center, who had suddenly lost track of Flight 6074. They tried to contact the flight crew multiple times using multiple means, but were unable to reach them. At that moment, apprehension must have gripped them, fearing the worst for Flight 6074. However, as events unfolded, they realized that their concerns were not exclusive to Flight 6074 alone. Going back to his radar, the air traffic controller realized something horrifying. The path, which Flight 6074 had been on before disconnecting, was on a potential collision course with the path for another aircraft, an American Airlines Boeing 777. He hurriedly moved to contact the American Airlines Flight 63 crew and asked if they could see the EasyJet plane on their Traffic Collision and Avoidance System, or TCAS display, which would have alerted its flight crew if this was the case. However, for the TCAS warnings to be sounded, both aircraft would have needed their avoidance systems to be on. But as Flight 6074 had suffered from an electrical failure, this wasn't possible. The crew of American Airlines Flight 63 began to manually look around the horizon for the EasyJet plane. With each passing minute, the situation became more drastic as both aircraft drew closer and closer together. The controller tried to assess the situation, determining the optimal course of action to prevent a potentially catastrophic collision between both aircraft. However, as he was unable to receive any vectors from Flight 6074, it was difficult to give any orders to the American Airlines flight. As he didn't have many options, he decided to ask the American Airlines flight to descend to 31,000 feet. But would this be enough to avoid a collision? Despite being the one who had the most information around Flight 6074, the controller decided to step aside for his colleague for a shift change and briefed them as much as he could. At that point, American Airlines Flight 63 hadn't begun its descent, and its crew were still manually looking out for the EasyJet aircraft. But the new controller requested that they descend immediately. A few moments later, a call was put through to the air traffic control. It was from the American Airlines flight crew, who informed the controller that they had just spotted an EasyJet aircraft pass overhead. It was Flight 6074. If they had not begun their descent, they would have collided. The controller was relieved to have avoided the disaster. Unfortunately, it wasn't the end of his concerns, as the Flight 6074 flight crew had still not been communicating and weren't reachable. There were fears that it could have been a hijacking, since it was obvious that the plane had not crashed. Meanwhile, the pilots of Flight 6074 were trying all they could to get the radio systems back on before it became a case of national security. The captain then decided to attempt something else from the ECAM checklist. It was a suggestion to switch the transponder system from number 1 to number 2. Somehow this worked, and its display came back to life. The transponder is what tells air traffic control the aircraft's position, and so if this worked, then air traffic control could finally be able to locate the aircraft. Thankfully it did, and the controller was able to see that the flight had continued on its normal path. However, the radio systems on Flight 6074 were still out. The flight crew then decided to update their squawk code on the transponder panel to 7700, which denoted a general emergency. When the controller saw this, he realized that whatever Flight 6074 had been facing was more serious than a radio failure. Back in the cockpit, the captain had continued to go through the entire ECAM checklists until they were essentially exhausted. He opted to think innovatively and devised a plan to toggle the APU off and then back on, recognizing that this particular system wouldn't typically be utilized if the aircraft were in perfect condition prior to departure. But as it turned out, the APU wasn't the cause of the problem. The display system still did not come on, and the flight crew had now essentially run out of options. The captain informed the lead flight attendant of the situation and requested that they prepare the passengers in the cabin for an emergency landing. That was the first time the passengers became aware of the situation. Back in the cockpit, the pilots were deliberating on whether to continue through to Bristol or divert the flight to a nearby airport. A diversion would be difficult to pull off without working radio systems, as such a move could have been interpreted as numerous things, by those potentially observing the plane. The flight crew also had more information for completing the landing at Bristol, something they could barely get if they were to divert to another airport. And so, they decided to continue the flight to Bristol, even if it meant they'd have to spend longer in the air. But there was still one potential pitfall of the pilot's plan to continue to Bristol. The airport had a rather short runway. Since there was a chance that some of the aircraft's systems, such as the thrust reversers and flaps, had also failed, landing on such a short runway would be extremely difficult. Nevertheless, the pilots decided, using the limited information available to them, to land on runway 09 left at Bristol. They then put in the flight's arrival route into the first officer's flight management computer. It was now time to initiate descent, and the first officer would have to complete it by hand, a feat which isn't too common in aviation today. With the relative lack of experience in the cockpit, it became an even more daunting task. Around this time, controllers in London who had been tracking the aircraft informed Bristol Air Traffic Control of its descent and the situation surrounding communication. And so, the controllers at Bristol declared a full emergency at the airport. Fire and emergency services rushed to the runway. Back on Flight 6074, the flight crew tested the flaps of the aircraft to see if they were functional before they got too close to the ground. To their joy, the flaps were deployed successfully. Landing Flight 6074 was now looking like a routine task again, as being able to adequately extend the flaps would have made the aircraft able to stop on the Bristol runway regardless of its length. However, there remained one crucial task: checking the landing gear, arguably the most vital component for a successful landing. Yet, their relief was fleeting, as there was no response whatsoever when the captain lowered the landing gear lever. Without the landing gear lowered, the aircraft may have had to land on its body, which contained not just the fuselage, but highly combustible engines. Moving at hundreds of miles per hour would mean a certain explosion. However, the A319 aircraft did have a backup system to lower the landing gear. A manual gravity gear extension system, which allows the landing gear to descend under its own weight. The pilots were able to activate this successfully and were now able to make concrete plans for landing. The captain instructed the first officer to use maximum reverse thrust on the engines as soon as the wheels of the landing gear came into contact with the runway. He then tried to use the mobile phones in the cockpit to reach out to Bristol Air Traffic Control for landing clearance, but once again, he was unable to reach them. Without landing clearance, the pilots pushed on as the runway was now in sight. And within a few moments, they touched down with the first officer immediately slamming the brakes. Seconds later, Flight 6074 had successfully come to a stop, with all 144 individuals on board safe and sound. The pilots had managed to land the troubled plane without any external communication. When those on the ground were informed of what had happened, they were surprised, as many had initially been suspecting something more sinister. Obviously, investigations into the incident had to be conducted to get answers. The investigations conducted by the British Air Accident Investigation Board revealed in a report that a faulty electrical feed in one of the aircraft's transformers had incorrectly sensed a flow of current which caused the main electrical bus to trip offline, knocking out every other system which depended on it. The report also blamed the inability of the flight crew to reconfigure the electrical system and the MEL provisions which allowed the flight to go on. The report recommended that plane manufacturer Airbus review the MEL provisions on its A320 series of aircraft when it comes to dispatching aircraft with an inoperative generator. It also called for a redesign of the push button for better power indication, and recommended that Airbus modify the affected aircraft to introduce automated transfer of electrical feed to the AC ESS or essential bus bar in the event of the loss of the AC Bus 1 bus bar, a recommendation which the EASA made compulsory. As a result of the incident, Airbus had to make sweeping changes to its A320 aircraft, and EasyJet had to update its training procedures to ensure that its crews don't struggle as much when faced with a similar situation in future. Because of those recommendations from the aviation authorities, particularly those made for the automatic transmission of faulty systems to working ones, As well as the redesign of the push button for better indication, modern aircraft systems are now safer and more redundant than those from only a couple of decades ago. Despite EasyJet Flight 6074 looking routine in the end, the efforts of the pilots cannot go without praise. For over an hour, they were shut off from external communication, but they were able to successfully complete a landing that even those on the ground had been skeptical of. But what do you think of Flight 6074? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care.